If you're a fan of the UFC, then you certainly know exactly who Jake Paul is. Well, recently Jake Paul made some controversial comments in hopes that he'll get his shot at the UFC, and in today's video, we're going to be dissecting what the blonde buffoon had to say. You're not going to want to miss a second of this video, so stick around till the very end to get the whole story. First up, Jake Paul has issued an official warning. Jake Paul has been fighting professionally for the past 2 years and is now apparently ready to become the next big name in combat sports. Jake Paul won his last bout, which was a rematch against Tyron Woodley, with a huge knockout win in the 6th round of the match. Since then, Paul's been on a warpath, trying to annoy Dana White to the point of allowing him to fight one of his warriors in a legitimate UFC bout. In December of 2021, Jake Paul warned multiple fighters in the UFC that they were next on his radar and that they should all be scared of fighting Jake Paul. Paul officially warned 4 professional UFC fighters that he'll be fighting one of them in 2022 and that he will embarrass them. Jake Paul officially warned Dana White that he intends to fight one of Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, Kamaru Usman, or Jorge Masvidal, and that he will embarrass them too, he said. I promise you that. Now, I'm not exactly sure why Jake Paul thinks he can insult members of the UFC and just magically get a fight with any of them, but let me be the first to say that if Jake Paul managed to secure a fight with any of these athletes, they would sit him down so fast that Jake Paul wouldn't even know the fight had begun. Jake Paul is a tremendous athlete. I can't take that away from him. He has worked hard to be in as good a shape as he currently is. I'll give him that, but it is clear that he has fought opponents that were not in as good a shape as he is, and all of his opponents have been quite a bit older than him and quite a bit smaller. Furthermore, the purse and terms of the bout were always set by Jake Paul and his team, giving his opponent very little say in the matter. Additionally, many of his and his brother's bouts have been questionable at best in terms of legitimacy, which means that if Jake Paul were to change out the boxing gloves for grappling gloves and get in the ring under official UFC rules, I think that Jake Paul would not be a fan of the results. But it will most likely not matter, as there is essentially no way that Jake Paul is getting an audience with the UFC anytime soon, at least not in the way that Jake Paul would like. Next, Jake Paul is dead set on fighting in the UFC as soon as this summer. After 2 years of boxing under his belt, Jake Paul is ready to go for a different kind of belt altogether. Paul has recently verbally attacked the UFC in hopes that somebody will take his bait and offer him a chance to put his money where his mouth is. While most people, myself included, think that Jake Paul, the YouTuber turned boxer, would be massively outmatched by any fighter in the UFC, he continues to run his mouth in interviews, knowing that his insults and annoying antics could one day potentially get him a fight with a pro fighter in the UFC. Jake Paul recently unloaded his thoughts on his career and his odds against UFC fighters, and I don't think anyone was too impressed. Paul said, "It's scary to try and put a cap on where this could go. The potential is unlimited. It's up to me, my team, how hard I work. I'm motivated. While I do respect the amount of work he has put in to craft this villain character and how hard he has worked physically to be in this great of shape, I do think he's just trying to get a rise out of either Dana White or one of the fighters in the UFC so he can get his shot at a spot in the UFC. He wants to prove himself to everyone, which once again I respect. However, I strongly disagree with how he's doing it." Paul continued to call out fighters in the UFC, essentially saying that they weren't as good as he is at his age and that he can take any of them on and win. "After 2 years as a professional, this is astronomical," Paul said. "I would love to fight higher opposition as I go. Maybe, when the time is right, I'll go for the world title." He hasn't even had a single fight in the UFC, and already he's talking about the world title. This is where he loses my respect. You just can't talk your way into a world title fight. Paul continued to brag about his little success in combat sports by trying to dress up the fact that he has fought and won against retired athletes and substitute teachers by saying that he has fought and won 4 massive fights in 13 months. Nobody in the history of boxing has done what I've done at this age. He then tried to link himself to the UFC fighters by comparing him to one of the sport's best fighters. "The only person as active as me is Saul Canelo Alvarez." People can easily see through his fake tough guy persona, and even after all of this commotion made by Paul last year, people were all very confident that he was never going to get a shot in the UFC until a recent challenge was offered by Jake Paul that has people thinking we may see Jake Paul in the octagon after all. Next up, Jake Paul has challenged Dana White to a winner-takes-all challenge. As some of you probably know, Jake Paul has been a thorn in the side of Dana White and the UFC for quite some time now. He has disagreed heavily with the fact that the UFC fighters are not given any long-term health care after their time in the UFC, despite the league raking in hundreds of millions of dollars each year, with the overwhelming majority of their fighters not seeing a very large portion of that cash, despite being the ones putting their health and safety on the line. Jake Paul has constantly called out Dana White for not paying his fighters enough and for refusing to give the fighters enough compensation to afford health care or providing health care for each fighter directly through league profits. Jake Paul has now tweeted at Dana White offering a one-fight solution to the problem, and it is juicy enough for Dana White to potentially take Jake up on his offer. Jake Paul Paul tweeted the following, saying, "How about a one-fight UFC deal to fight Conor? If I win, you agree to my UFC fighter pay and healthcare proposal. If I lose, I donate my entire purse to all UFC fighters who make less than $50,000 a fight and never mention UFC again. Deal?" While Dana White has yet to respond, it is doubtful that he will, unless it is to accept the terms of the fight. And while I would personally love to see Jake Paul get absolutely cleaned up by Conor McGregor, I doubt this will ever happen. Dana White knows that this fight would get millions of pay-per-view viewers and would undoubtedly be the most watched and talked about event in the UFC for the year, but he also knows that he in no way can bow down to the will of some YouTuber turned boxer just for the money. He also knows that there's a slim chance that Jake Paul finds a way to beat McGregor, which means that Dana White would have to implement dramatic change to the UFC, which is something he clearly doesn't want to do, or else he would have done it already. As much as Jake Paul wants this fight, he will most likely not be getting it anytime soon. If Jake Paul wants to be in the UFC, he's going to have to do what every other fighter did and earn his way to the top, which he clearly is not interested in, because if he was actually willing to do that, he would have started there rather than bad-mouthing every single member of the UFC. Jake does have an advantage in the fact that every fan of combat sports is willing to pay to see his fights, which essentially makes him a title fight fighter in the UFC. However, he does lack the proven pedigree to contend with any other legit title fighter in the UFC. Again, we would all love to see Jake Paul step into the octagon simply for the fact that he would get pumped by any UFC fighter today, and we would all be free of his insane antics, and we could all go back to watching actual fighters take each other on in a sport that has made its living off of respect, honor, and pure competition, rather than this petty, childish feuding trend that Jake and Logan Paul have attempted to cash in on. The pair have no place in combat sports, not just because of their lack of actual skill, but because of their attitudes and mindset. The pair have no intention of fighting because of the competition or the skill it takes to be a skilled fighter. These two are in it for the publicity and the money, and that is something we do not need in this sport. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.